Hi, everyone. This is Shannon Williams with Rancher Labs. Thank you so much for joining our August online meetup. It looks like we are going to have a great audience today. So thanks everyone for taking time out of your summer days to come and listen to us chat a little bit about cluster templates in the upcoming Rancher 2.3 release. So just a quick introduction. I'm Shannon Williams. I'm one of the founders here at Rancher, and I work in our field teams. We work with all of our users and customers and clients out there who use Rancher. My co-founder, Darren Shepard, usually joins me for this meetup. He's actually on vacation off today. So I'm lucky to be joined by two of our really original engineers, Prachi, who is the lead engineer on the feature we're going to be seeing today. He's going to be joining and giving us a demo. And Bill, who's joined many of these online meetups, one of the original team here at Rancher. He's our product manager for Rancher, and we'll be talking a little bit about the context for the 2.3 release. So you can follow both of them on Twitter or in GitHub, and you can always find me on Twitter. Just a couple of housekeeping items for those of you who this is your first Rancher online meetup. We've been running these for the last 3 years, and they really are they're really meant to be a community gathering. We treat this as a meetup, not a webinar. And that has really a lot of context. Fundamentally, we mean this to be an open discussion where we show you things. We don't really set a time limit for these. So unlike our typical trainings or master classes or anything else that we run that kind of have an hour, maybe an hour and a half deadline, these really are for open-ended. We go as long as people have questions. So we record the whole thing. Your questions are always welcome. We'll try to answer them as you go. As those of you know, we get literally hundreds of questions over the course of the hour and a half, 2 hours that we're on this session. So please don't fret if we don't get to your question for 10 minutes or even 20 minutes sometimes. Maybe because we're going to answer it in a present slide or in part of the demo coming up, or we may not have, I may not know the answer, or someone may not know the answer. We may be looking up the answer or something like that. So don't worry too much if it takes a while. Feel free to ask it again if you feel like we missed your question. Sometimes we do. But the whole idea with this is to have a technical discussion with other people who are using Rancher or thinking about using Rancher or trying to understand how to best practices for using containers and Kubernetes in production. We do focus on demos as opposed to slides. So there will be a few slides to sort of set the context and maybe show some examples of things. But for the most part, we're going to be demoing today, showing you this, this new concept of cluster templates. And because of that, occasionally things break. We try to have backups and stuff ready, but as things go, please be patient, bear with us. We'll chat and walk you through if it's not working, why it's not working. This meetup is being recorded. You can always find the previous meetups in our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/rancher. You can find them on our website. They're kind of easy to find, but we've got a whole channel of them where you can see 30, 40 of these meetups that we've done over the years. So feel free to go back and look. If you are new, we have a great tradition of people kind of saying hello to the community on our Twitter channel. Just use the hashtag Rancher Meetup and introduce yourself. We love getting to know you, sticking your picture up here on our wall of fame, and please don't hesitate to say a little bit about why you're here and what you're doing. We also have a Slack channel. If you aren't familiar, you can use slack.rancher.io to find all of the other people using Rancher. There are thousands of people on the channel. We also have an online meetup, a sub-channel in there. So if you just want to chat with other people during this, feel free to go in there. Obviously, we won't be on there, but we'll pop in later after it ends to respond to any things that come in there. Okay, so with that, today's agenda. I'll give just a couple quick slides on who Rancher is for anyone who's new to us. So that'll take 3 to 5 minutes. Then we'll dive into the content. Bill is going to start us off. He's going to explain everything that's going on with Rancher 2.3, when you can expect to see it. He'll talk a little bit about this kind of feature, as well as some of the ones we've already announced. Point you to where you can get your hands on some of the early previews of this code. And then Prachi will dive into the detail on cluster templates, how to use them, what they're for, and where you can find more information on best practices and the likes. With the end, we'll kind of give a quick update on other projects. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on with what's going on with some of the other Rancher projects like K3S and K3OS and Rio and such, and then we'll take any final questions you have, and that'll be it. So with that, let me just start by giving just a bit of context about Rancher. So Rancher is now a 4-year-old company. We've been working on containers and Kubernetes that whole time, and we've seen maybe the most exciting thing in the last 2 or 3 years has just been the rapid adoption of Kubernetes as a consistent way to manage containers. There's a great report the 451 just came out with a couple of months ago. They did a survey of enterprise organizations, and I think something we've all felt, but now are sort of validating, is that almost everybody is beginning to standardize on Kubernetes. And what's cool about that is that standardization is happening in the data center and in the cloud, but even more, it's happening in what's more exciting is it's happening inside of the development process. Teams that are building applications using microservices are kind of beginning to use Kubernetes as the basis for these new applications. And so we're seeing Kubernetes on developer laptops. We're seeing Kubernetes as CI. We're seeing it in production, and we're seeing a lot of projects now where Kubernetes is pushing its way out into the edge. And earlier this year when we released K3S, a really lightweight Kubernetes distro, we were kind of amazed at the pickup it's had. I mean, both as a sort of single node Kubernetes implementation for running Kubernetes anywhere, but also as sort of automated Kubernetes into people's dev environments and lab environments. So, this is, this excitement of Kubernetes running across the board really is highlighting what is, becoming the key challenges for organization, and that is how to centralize management of Kubernetes running in all of these places. As we see Kubernetes clusters appearing in more and more places within an organization, I think some of the initial ideas that organizations would run one big Kubernetes service and that would be how everyone got access to infrastructure have really proven to be incorrect. And instead, what we're seeing is Kubernetes itself is more like cattle. It is something that you're going to have lots of. You're going to manage clusters. Clusters will have life cycles. They'll come and go. And what becomes really important for organizations then is delivering these clusters reliably, providing operational consistency in terms of how they're deployed, standardizing around their configuration, their security policies, who can access them, and then more and more providing tooling around the clusters so that teams don't have to kind of build from the foundation up when they get to Kubernetes, but rather they're able to take Kubernetes and quickly get into monitoring and log management and testing and application templates and all the other things think of as sort of stage 2, day 2 operations of apps on Kubernetes. And at Rancher, we're kind of focused on really these two challenges. One, how do we deliver Kubernetes everywhere? And two, how do we manage Kubernetes everywhere? So from the delivery of Kubernetes everywhere, our vision is really that, for the most part, Kubernetes is Kubernetes. As long as you're using a certified distribution, there's lots of great ways to get a Kubernetes cluster. If you're in the cloud, the hosted Kubernetes are great options, EKS, AKS, GKE, or any KES you can think of from your cloud provider. Will give you a really good fully managed Kubernetes that's quite cost effective, usually deployed across multiple availability zones. And at the end of the day, it's the same Kubernetes, right? It's got the same API, it's certified. If you need to run Kubernetes yourself, Rancher has a really good distribution called RKE. It's very popular. It's all enables automated operations. This makes up a huge percentage of the clusters that people run with Rancher. And more and more, as you're looking for standalone, unattended operations, the demand for tools like K3S is really going up. And we expect to see that continue as teams look at running Kubernetes in shops and factories, on medical devices, on satellites, in all sorts of places that you can't even imagine today. And so, in the broadest sense, we expect Kubernetes to be more and more ubiquitous, this commonly available compute platform that organizations will grasp and use as the foundation for running their applications. And so, the Rancher product is really designed to be a centralized, unified management plane for all of these clusters. And what that means is absorbing, certainly our RKE and K3S clusters, but also managing clusters that were created by, created in the cloud, or even created from other distros, or created by hand, or created the hardware, however you want to get there. As long as you're giving a certified Kubernetes cluster, you should be able to deploy it and then connect it into Rancher, so that Rancher can then provide really centralized management. And that means 2-3 kind of core management areas. One is policy management, defining what the policy configuration should be across all of these, what type of network and security policies you want to configure and deploy, what RBAC policies you want to have on different clusters, and how to ensure correct configuration, which is what we're going to be talking about mostly today, as well as a lot of the operational stuff, deploying, upgrading, maintaining Kubernetes backhaven and recovery of the etcd components, everything around provisioning infrastructure and infrastructure scaling and things like that. And then integration into your auth and managing who people are and what they're allowed to do, while at the same time providing this tooling. Rancher enables you to easily turn on capabilities like Prometheus and Fluentd and Istio and Helm and Jenkins on your cluster so that you can access these curated implementations of open source projects. So that's what Rancher is. All of these projects I'm talking about, Kubernetes, Rancher, K3s, RKE, they're all open source, they're free, they're totally available. Our company Rancher just provides support on these projects. So 20,000 teams in the world that use Rancher, and about 300 of those are enterprise organizations that work with Rancher Labs to get support on the stack. So hopefully that gives you an idea of who we are and what we do. If you're interested in more information on that, just go ahead and hit rancher.com or send me a note, and we're happy to explain more about what we're doing as a company. But today's focus is going to be on our 2.3 release, which is coming up in a couple months, and will include a whole bunch of great new features. So with that, I want to turn it over to Bill to talk about this release. Bill, I'm going to make you the presenter. Can you present your slides now?
I'm going to show my screen.
All right, I can see it.
Great. Oops. Oh, sorry, that was too far ahead. All right, so Rancher 2.3 update. We're pretty excited. It's GAing in October, and that'll be fully supported and ready to go. Today's alpha release, or if you want to play with what you're seeing today, check out our alpha release. We're using version 2.30-alpha 7. I want to emphasize that there's no upgrades from this version. So just use this on your kind of test and demo clusters. But we're pretty excited about this coming. It's got some major new features. We've covered some of these in past meetups. And if you'd like to get more in depth, there's YouTube links to those presentations below. But at a high level, we were bringing Istio support. We're pretty excited about having service mesh on Rancher, and we're bringing kind of everything that kind of Istio entails. So you'll have the UI through Kiali, you'll be able to do tracing through Jaeger, see all the dashboards in Grafana, and within the Rancher UI itself, you'll be able to manage your virtual services and destination rules. So we're pretty excited about that. Windows is coming along. We will support Windows Server 1903 and the worker nodes. So these clusters will be, they'll require some Linux hosts to run the control plane and administrative components of the Kubernetes cluster, but your workloads can run on the Windows Server 1903. We're going to support Kubernetes version 1.14 or greater, and we will have the Flannel CNI plugin with VXLAN and host network, or host gateway. But today we're really focusing on cluster templates. And so what we really were noticing kind of with Rancher and kind of how we got to this feature was that Kubernetes is everywhere. And pretty quickly, what we're seeing, or what we observed, was users are building a lot more smaller clusters than managing one large cluster at any given time. So you really end up with a lot of Kubernetes clusters pretty quickly. And so you need a way to manage that. So Rancher, brings the self-service model and makes it really easy to provision clusters and consume Kubernetes from everywhere. And we have all the hooks to kind of make that production ready. But what we saw is that there's some challenges when it comes to enforcing security and add-on configurations that need to be sort of standardized before turning it over to the end user. And so our kind of response to that has been cluster templates. And so with that, you get version cluster configurations for Rancher provision clusters. And we can enforce these across all new clusters that are being provisioned in an environment. And these templates, you're working with your admins, your security teams, your DevOps teams to really embed kind of the best practices into these templates to ensure that these cluster templates are being used in all clusters across your organization, and you can be confident that what you would like to be in your production environments is actually there. And so kind of pre-cluster templates, if you wanted to secure these configurations, typically a cluster requester would request these clusters from like an automated process. And so the automated process would use some configuration that's been kind of distilled down by your DevOps team and your security team as to what the cluster needs to look like. And then that would interact with Rancher. The user, there was some risk in certain circumstances where customers, they just didn't want to give the end user that much control and flexibility, provisioning cluster templates. And so when you bypass that automated process in those cases, and if the user ended up going straight to Rancher, you could really end up with like a lot of snowflake clusters, and you really have no way to sort of kind of guarantee without sort of manually going and poking and taking a look and see what that's looking like. And so to address this, we've brought in cluster templates. And so here, now Rancher has a standardized configuration that's been worked on by your DevOps team, security teams, and it's now within Rancher, and it's now Rancher's responsibility to enforce that template is being used on all the clusters being created, making sure that these standardized configurations are going to be used everywhere. And so now with Rancher enforcing it, your automated processes, your web UI, and your API, regardless of how you're interacting with Rancher in the self-service model, or turning it over to users, or if you're still using your automated process, you're still guaranteeing that your clusters are uniform and consistent as they're being produced. And so, you have versioning, and you can increment the versions and sort of see what those will look like. And now, where we see this going is by leveraging kind of like the Rancher 2 Terraform provider. It'll be able to leverage the cluster templates at the 2.3.0 release time. And it'll also support catalog apps, multi-cluster apps. So then now if you were to create a Terraform module with the Rancher 2 provider, you can really create a production-ready cluster that you get a lot closer in kind of a one-step process to deliver kind of that comprehensive operationally ready package. So it could install your monitoring agents, and it'll install any other tooling that you need on every host, before turning those clusters over to your users. And we think this is going to be a pretty powerful set of features. And so at a high level, that's sort of what we're working on, or what we're bringing out, and want to be able to show that to you. So I think let me get right more to the demo, and I will turn this over to Prachi.
Before you turn it over, there were a couple questions, Bill, that I think you might want to answer. One is from Jean Carlos. He said just about the Windows Server thing. He said, will Windows Server be the cluster manager, or will it still depend on a Unix server, Linux server?
It'll still depend on a Linux server for the control plane for the Kubernetes components. So you'll still need a couple nodes to run etcd and the Kubernetes API server endpoints. So it'll just be for your workload nodes that'll be running Windows.
Okay, and then another question was from Rick. He said, with regards to Prometheus and Grafana in 2.3, what does that mean? Are you offering the deployment and update of these services, UI integration into Rancher's console? Do you want to just talk about where we are? Because Prometheus and Grafana are actually in 2.2, and what's changing with 2.3 maybe is worth chatting about. Can you talk about that just briefly?
Yeah, so Istio does a lot of metrics collection as well. And so in 2.3, if you're already using our monitoring solution from 2.2, I believe it will end up leveraging that Prometheus instance to get the data that it needs to that Istio. So Istio has dashboards in Grafana, and it will use that Prometheus, the 2.2 Prometheus, if it's present, to render those dashboards. The Prometheus will be wired up to scrape the endpoints that Istio ends up exposing. If it's not there, then with Istio, we'll deploy a Prometheus instance and the Grafana dashboards, and it'll communicate with that. But it's a core component of a lot of the metrics collection that you can get out of Istio. One of its key things is a lot of metrics get generated and collected and visualized so that you can see how your services are performing and behaving in the service mesh.
Okay, great. All right, well, Prachi, you are now the presenter. So if you want to get us going, we can start talking through this feature in a little bit more detail.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
All right, welcome everyone. I'll be doing the demo of this Rancher 2.3 feature cluster templates. So while we are demoing, I'll go over a little bit of technical details and functionality through my slides, and then we will also go to the Rancher's 2.3 UI to demonstrate the cluster template workflow. As Bill mentioned, cluster templates, as the name suggests, is templating your cluster configuration. So this is a feature that can be used by admins to predefine cluster configuration and provide all the recommended settings that the admins want the users to use to launch their clusters from the Rancher setup. So what can one specify in the cluster template? Cluster template can be used to specify pretty much all the parameters that you can specify currently on Rancher 2.2 in our Create Cluster API. So the cluster templates currently is supporting Rancher provisioned clusters only. So also known as the clusters which are provisioned via RKE. In the cluster templates, you can bake in the Kubernetes as well as Rancher settings to be applied for cluster creation. So these settings consist of default cluster options like the Kubernetes version, cloud provider options, port security policy, network security policy, any add-ons the admins would like to be launched on the clusters that are created by the users can also be specified in the cluster templates. Along with all these options, there is a facility to set some overrides. So these are the settings that the admin would like the cluster creator or the consumer of the template to answer. So for example, credentials, access keys, secret keys that the user should enter while creating the cluster, they cannot be baked in by the admin into the cluster templates. So such settings can be turned over and set as overrides on the cluster template. When the user is going to create a cluster via the template, these settings can be filled in by the cluster creator or the user himself. So this is a cluster template in YAML format. So as you can see, if you are familiar with the cluster YAML of Rancher provisioned clusters, this is the exact format of the cluster YAML. So the cluster template can be specified using this YAML format. It includes all the cluster configuration, Rancher Kubernetes engine config. You can specify your ingress controllers, your network providers and network plugins, and the settings needed by them. Also, all the Kubernetes components like Kube API or Kube Controller, Kubelet, or any of the services like etcd, Kube API, they can be configured via providing the settings of these services in the YAML format. Along with this YAML format, the cluster template, of course, is also supported in our Rancher 2.3 UI. So all these settings can as well be set via our UI form. Moving on to the cluster template workflow. So cluster template is by default a global admin or admin only feature. So this can be used by the admins to create the cluster configurations into these objects called a cluster template. And the cluster template contains the cluster configuration specified as revisions of the template. So the first configuration that the admin specifies is saved as the default revision of the template. If there will be further modifications to the cluster configuration, admin can create multiple revisions of the cluster template. The cluster templates that the admin creates, he can share them with other users in the Rancher setup. Once these cluster templates are available for the users, they can use this to create the cluster. So while creating the cluster, using the Rancher 2.3 cluster API, a user can specify the cluster template and a specific revision from that cluster template to be applied. Once a revision is specified, that template settings in that revision will be applied to the cluster as is. They cannot change any settings, except for if there are any settings that have been set by the admin as overrides, the cluster user will have to fill them up. And this mostly is needed in cases where the users want to fill up their own credentials. With this, I'll hop on to demo the cluster template creation and how it can be applied to create a cluster. So this is my Rancher setup, and I have logged in as an admin. Now, cluster templates are tied up to your user profile. So under the user profile, you can see the cluster templates option available. Once you click on the cluster templates, it lists all the templates that have been created. Now, if I'm a standard user, it will also list all the templates that the admin has shared with me. To create a cluster template, you have to click on Add Template. You can give a name to the template and a revision name. We will go to the sharing of a template later. Moving on of what are the cluster configuration that can be set in a revision. Now the cluster configuration or the cluster options, the admin can set all the Kubernetes options, all the cloud provider options that are needed if they want to create a cluster using a particular cloud provider. You can also set, disable or enable the private registry and provide the private registry URL and credentials. Advanced options like ingress controllers, your node port range, port security and network security policy. Also, the backup targets for HCD snapshots can also be configured using templates. So as you can see, this form is pretty much similar to add cluster form that is available right now on the Rancher UI. So if I go to the add cluster and try to provision a cluster using say DigitalOcean or some infrastructure provider, all the cluster options that are available right now are pretty much all of them are provided and they can be predefined on the cluster template UI. So I'll go ahead and create this one cluster template. Now suppose I want to let my user create a cluster with Kubernetes 1.14. I can choose that as a Kubernetes version and create this cluster template. Once the template is created with a revision, under my clusters, if I go and try to add a cluster, for all the RKE created or Rancher provisioned clusters, you will be able to apply the template that is available or that is created. So I can say use an existing cluster template. It lists all the templates that are available to me. And then it will also list all the different revisions that are available under that template. Right now, we only have one revision created, which is the default. I'll quickly go ahead and try to spin up this cluster. Now, as you can see, since I have applied a cluster template to my cluster, the settings from the template are applied to the cluster as is. I cannot go and change any of the settings because they are picked up from the template that the admin has provided. So I can go and create this cluster. Now, what if the admin wants to provide the users the ability to go and edit certain settings? For that, while creating my template, I can set certain settings as overrides on the cluster template. For example, if I want my users to specify their own node port range on the UI, you can turn this particular setting as an overridable setting by clicking on this option. So what it does is I'm creating a template with this override option and I'm providing a default to it, but it also means that whenever a user is going to create a cluster using this template, they can, if they want to, go and change this setting since they have been specified as overrides on the cluster. So if I create this template right now, the demo 2, and if I try to add a cluster using my second template that I had just created, you can see that rest of the settings that I had provided cannot be edited except for those that I had turned on as overrides. So in this way, the admin can set some settings that he wants the user or the cluster creator to enter. This is particularly useful to enter the credentials for etcd backup snapshots or any of the cloud credentials that you want the cluster creator to manage. Now, after a cluster is created, and if there are certain settings that are not set as overrides, how can that cluster be upgraded to a new cluster configuration? So this brings us back to how can a cluster template configuration be updated? Now, cluster template updates flow lets you define new cluster template revisions. So you can either define a new cluster template revision and set new cluster configuration, or you can clone from an existing revision, make changes that are needed and save it as a new revision. So in this way, because there is a revision support provided to the cluster template, it is easy to manage updates to the cluster configuration without touching the clusters which are already running using some of the revision of this template. When you have multiple revisions available for a cluster template, you can as well change any revision to become the default revision of the cluster template. Once these updates have been specified as cluster template revisions, they can be applied to the cluster by the edit cluster option. So you can switch a cluster to a new revision of the same cluster template that it is being created from. I should note that if a cluster has been created from a cluster template, if you are editing a cluster, you cannot change to any other altogether different cluster template. You can only change between revisions of the same cluster template. Now, any settings that the cluster template revisions are mentioning, which are set as overrides on the template revision, they can of course be edited via edit cluster functionality. Going back to the demo, so I have this demo cluster which we had just created, and we had specified this cluster template with the Kubernetes version, say 1.14. Now, suppose that the latest Kubernetes version is made available, which is say 1.15, and you want to upgrade this cluster to the latest Kubernetes version available. Now, since this cluster is created from a template, my edit cluster doesn't let me change to any other template, but I can as well change to some of any of the cluster template revisions available. So in this case, in order to upgrade, say, my Kubernetes version, I would have to go back to my cluster templates and clone a new revision or create a new revision from default. and then specify the latest Kubernetes version that is made available via Rancher. Once I save this revision, I can go back to my cluster and using the edit cluster functionality, as you can see, this cluster is now active and provisioned with Kubernetes 1.14.5. I can change it to the new revision that the admin has made available. And once this new revision will be applied, the cluster will get upgraded to the Kubernetes 1.15.2 Kubernetes version. So using revisions is one way to update the cluster configuration on the clusters. And the other way, yeah,
oh,
go
sorry,
ahead.
why don't you finish that thought? I just had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask
Yeah,
from.
just a little note to finish it is, along with revisions, the other way is when I'm creating a cluster template revision, I could as well have made Kubernetes version as an overridable option. What this would do is the cluster creator or the user can choose the admin provided version as 1.14.5, or they can also choose any other Kubernetes versions that are made available via Rancher. And if new versions are released later, they can edit the cluster and just choose the new latest version available without needing a new revision. So this is the other way to let users upgrade their clusters. Yeah, Shannon.
Prachi, fantastic so far. Loads of questions. Michael had a question that someone else had asked as well. He said, can a template be applied against an existing cluster under Rancher management? So if I have a cluster, say a 2.2 cluster, I upgrade to 2.3, can I now apply this to, either upgrade the cluster or sort of begin configuring and enforcing controls on it?
No, right now, only new clusters can be provisioned via defining cluster templates. If there's an existing 2.2 or an old cluster, we cannot edit it and apply a cluster template to it. But the admins can go ahead and define the cluster settings in a template and then use it further for new clusters.
So another question was from Lori, and she asked about, she said, you said these templates will help provision the cluster instances. Could I use this in an AWS environment to install the EFS utilities and mount an EFS drive to each instance, for example? So can I script things as part of the cluster template that would then kick in, post provisioning, for example?
So these templates are basically for Rancher provisioned clusters. So if you're going to use, you're going to spin up Kubernetes clusters using AWS or EC2 nodes, using RKE or the Rancher provisioning, then you can use the cluster template. And then if there are certain things that you want to get installed on the cluster that is launched, they can be provided as add-ons that the admin wants for us to go and install on the cluster once it's launched. So there are user-defined add-ons which are documented on our Rancher site, where you can provide probably the applications that you want us to go and install on the clusters after it has been launched via Rancher, and RKE will be able to go and download these add-ons and install them. To do that, you have to use the add-ons include directive or paste the YAML version of the application that you want to get Rancher install it on your cluster. And this YAML format can be pasted in the cluster template YAML, and we will be able to take it on from there.
And I'm assuming you can also maintain it and just use the API to pull this in, correct?
You can use the API, cluster create API as well to put in the YAML format.
If I can expand a little bit too. The relationship here is that the cluster template is focused primarily on Kubernetes, its configuration and applications that are running. And so it works in conjunction with Rancher's node templates, or if you're using custom clusters, then then those systems are responsible for configuring the node. So in the node driver, so if you're using EC2, Rancher's node template to provision EC2 instances, as part of that, the AMI that node template's consuming, or as part of the Docker installation script that you can override, those are sort of the paths for controlling what ends up on the node and brings it up to kind of the Docker level. Outside of Rancher, if you're using kind of the custom model, it's up to your existing systems, Terraform or Ansible or whatever you're using to provision your nodes and bring it up to the point where it can run the Docker registration command for registering it into Rancher. So the node provisioning piece is, works in tandem with this. So we've had a couple of questions also in currently today as you're trying to build, like CIS compliant clusters. And so part of that is writing like an encryption config file and also writing a audit log config file. And so today, Rancher doesn't, RKE provision clusters don't have the ability to write files. We're working on that. We see that as a shortcoming. And so what you can do today is work in tandem with this. So your provisioning system, can write those files to disk, and then in the cluster template, you specify where that location is going to be, and add those as extra mounts to the kubelet, the kube API server, and then make sure that the kube API server flags in this template always look at that location and that file for that config file. And so with this gets you a lot closer because you can create a template that has all of the flags that are outlined in the CIS benchmark. As part of the 2.3 release, we will be providing a reference cluster template in the hardening guide. And then throughout sort of the 2.3 release cycles, we'll as we address the issues, particularly around write files, we will have a pre-canned template of what that could look like.
Bill, that's great. Well, there was one question earlier we asked about, could you apply this to a pre-created cluster? And said no, it only works on new clusters and building out new clusters. David kind of followed it up with saying, are there any plans to support previously created clusters? People have a lot of clusters in production. If they want to begin to enforce this moving forward, is there anything we think could be done to allow that maybe in an upcoming release, if not in 2.3?
It's something we've looked at and considered, but weren't sure, kind of if that was going to be something that was needed, especially on day one, because there's a lot of variability potentially in all of these clusters. So it's kind of a big one to tackle. So getting the capability and being able to sort of do this was our first goal, but then we were going to kind of wait and see what kind of the feedback was on that being able to deploy against existing clusters.
Rob asked a question. He said, basically, could we use this to automatically set up namespaces and service accounts?
So yeah, Prachi was pointing out the add-on section of the RKE config allows you to either call out and pull down Kubernetes manifests or put them in line directly, and those could be included as part of the template. So if you have the Kubernetes manifest to create your namespace or service account or role bindings or whatever you need, it just basically does a kube apply. And we'll provision those in the cluster. So if there's things like that you want to make sure get baked into the cluster as part of your standard installation that are absolutely required, then yes, the cluster template can enforce that. You might want to consider also, depending on how often those things change for you and what the maintenance overhead is. There's the Rancher 2 Terraform provider, which also provides you some flexibility there. Again, it just depends on what level of kind of enforcement that you're looking for. But if you don't want to put it in the template because it changes frequently and you don't want to have frequent template updates, you could look at maybe using the Terraform provider, but cluster templates can certainly help address your needs as well.
There was a you just mentioned the RKE Terraform provider. Gabriel asked if there are any plans to create an RKE Terraform, official RKE Terraform provider for a Rancher supported version, I think is what he said. And anything you can update that. There's also, Tom just asked, will this feature be included in the Terraform provider at launch? Can you talk a little bit about the Terraform provider?
Yeah, so Rancher 2 has a Terraform provider that is actively maintained by Rancher developers. And so we are working on adding cluster template support right now, and Rancher catalog support, and a few other key components. But basically, at the time of 2.3, we definitely see these as very important features to have in the provider. So we are working on that now, actually. As far as the RKE provider, we internally, our own modules, and the stuff that we build, we actually use the community one, and have been pretty pleased with it. So we haven't looked at pulling it in or creating one that would kind of take over or supersede it. But it's certainly something we could look at.
There were a couple questions. Kevin, Ujwal, Josh, Helen all asked questions that are sort of about node templates. So Kevin said, does a cluster template allow you to define maximum, minimum worker nodes, and auto-scaling and self-healing when one of the node goes down? Ujwal said, would it support VMware infrastructure to create VMs and then create Kubernetes clusters on those VMs? Josh said, any plans to support OpenStack? And Helen said, can I have multiple different types of node templates in a cluster template? Maybe etcd and workers should be of different sizes. So a whole bunch of good questions all about sort of the infrastructure getting provisioned and whether the templates can kind of enforce or support different things there. Do you want to tackle those, guys? I can read them to you one at a time if you'd rather take them one at a time, but I think they're all kind of tied together into how are we approaching node templates and self-healing and auto-scaling and with the cluster templates.
Yeah, I'll take a pass at it, and then Prachi, maybe you can kind of demo it. So again, the relationship is that, think of it, there's a Rancher cluster, and it's made up of node pools or node templates, in the case of where we're provisioning nodes, and then a cluster template, which will configure Kubernetes. So the user still has flexibility when picking the actual hardware when creating the Rancher cluster. So they can use existing node templates that have been defined, or that they've sort of already set up, and customize those. And then they would be forced to select a node template or cluster template that would install Kubernetes on those nodes. But the underlying hardware, would be defined as part of the node template. And Prachi, I think an example would be
right. So cluster templates currently consist only of the cluster options or the Kubernetes options you want to apply to the Kubernetes cluster, but node template is not part of the cluster template. So node templates still are user-defined templates. So when the users are adding clusters, as Bill said, they still have the flexibility of choosing the infrastructure provider or where they bring the nodes from to spin their Kubernetes cluster is the user's choice. So if I'm going to spin up a cluster, the node template portion of the add cluster is still under the user control, while the cluster options, they can be created using cluster template that is available.
Okay. There were a couple more questions. Rick asked, he said, related to the template update being described, to update a cluster to a new version of Kubernetes, do I need to update the template and use the new template version, or can I update the cluster directly without a new template revision? And Prachi, I think you showed this a little bit, but maybe if you just touching it one more time.
Right. So there are the two ways. One is if the cluster template that is made available by the admin if it does not set the Kubernetes version as an overridable parameter, that is, if the admin had set the Kubernetes version as a fixed setting, then of course, in order to upgrade the cluster to a new Kubernetes version, the method will be to spin up a new revision of this cluster template and then apply the latest Kubernetes version available to this revision. After that is done, you go and edit the cluster and switch to the new revision that is made available. But if we don't want to use this revision method of upgrading the cluster, then in the template itself, the Kubernetes version can be set as an overridable option. What this does it, the admin can provide the recommendation, say latest 1.14 or latest 1.15 should be used to spin up the cluster. But since this is an overridable option, when I as a user is going to create my cluster, that if I choose this template, it will still let me choose the Kubernetes version that I want. And when such a cluster is edited, this overridable option is still available to go and change. So I can upgrade my cluster using just a regular edit cluster in that case.
Great. Prachi, why don't you finish, keep going with your demo. If your question hasn't been answered, Bill or I will try to answer it on the thing, but we'll also come back to any that we need to wrap up. So
right,
go ahead and keep going.
Okay, so this was about the cluster template create and update, and how do you create a cluster from it? How do you update a cluster by creating new revisions or by using overrides on the existing revisions? Moving on, the cluster template object itself are shareable. So as an admin, I can decide to make the cluster template available to specific users or groups by sharing them. Also, there's another option available is to make the cluster template public. This means that as an admin, I can create a template, I can set my guidelines or compliance policies for the clusters to be created from, and make this template public, and this will be available then to all the users in the Rancher installation to create clusters. So just to demonstrate this sharing option, going back to my cluster templates UI, if I add a template, under my cluster template, there's a share template option made available. So I can search for users and in my Rancher installation. So the users can be pulled from your authentication provider if the authentication is on. And along with the users or groups that you have searched, you can also specify what kind of access you want these users to grant. So I can say that a user could be an owner of the cluster template, in which case the user can manage the cluster template, add new revisions, disable, delete the cluster template. I would note that if you want to turn certain users as owner of the templates that you have added, then those users should also have a global role called as create cluster templates, which lets them manage that template. Other access type that is available, which will be of frequent use, is that I choose the users or groups I want to share the template with, and then set the access type as user. With the user access type, it gives a read-only access to the users, and it means that the users can list those templates and use them for creating new clusters from it. And the third part of sharing was making the template public. When I make it public, all the users in the system, I'm sharing it across all the users, all authenticated users of the system. Now, this sharing of templates is particularly useful in cluster template enforcement. Now, this cluster template enforcement is an admin workflow, and this is peculiarly useful when the global admin wants to restrict cluster creation in the Rancher setup via templates only. So it is a global setting which the admin can turn on. And once it is on, all the standard users of the Rancher installation will be able to add clusters only by choosing the cluster template and revisions that they can see or that admin has shared with them. Admins themselves can, under enforcement, can still create clusters with or without template and test out their settings to bypass enforcement. So the cluster template enforcement model will be peculiarly useful when the admins want to probably set some compliance policies or security guidelines and want all the clusters to follow that guidelines. So under the settings, to turn on enforcement, a new setting is available, cluster template enforcement. When the admin turns it on, I have a standard user in my system, say user1, and if I log in as that user, since cluster template enforcement is on, if I go and try to add a cluster of my own, I no longer basically get the choice to set my own settings, but I have to choose the cluster templates that have been shared by admin with me, and then pick the revisions that are available under that template. So because the enforcement is on, cluster creation gets restricted to the cluster templates only. So this is the cluster template enforcement mode. While it is on, admins can still keep on adding clusters and testing their settings the usual way, either by adding their own settings or using the cluster template. So this is the cluster template enforcement mode. So I think with this, Shannon, I have covered most of the demo of this cluster template features. If you want to go over any other questions that there are.
Yeah, thanks, Prachi. That was great. So the couple questions that came in, Lori had a question. She said, does changing the Kubernetes version cause disruption for running pods? So this is kind of a broader question about upgrading clusters, but you want to take that on, Bill? Prachi?
Yeah, the Kubernetes version, upgrading a cluster to the new Kubernetes version is an existing functionality. And when a cluster is edited and the new Kubernetes version is upgraded, it basically is seamless. So if Bill, if you want to go in depth of how the pods, existing pods of a cluster will get affected by that.
Yeah, it depends on the components that are getting updated. But it follows the standard kind of upgrade path that you're following today. And so, I mean, if your running application shouldn't really have any impact while the upgrade's happening. But if you were upgrading, say, like a low-level component like the CNI driver as part of this template update, you know, as those pods get updated on the host, they will experience a brief network blip while they get upgraded and replaced. But yeah, it's just leveraging everything that we're doing today as far as upgrades are concerned. And what it's buying you is now, if you want all versions of, if your organization sort of needs you to say, okay, all clusters need to be on this version, so everything needs to be, you can bake that into the template and not allow users the flexibility to sort of pick and choose. Or you want to make sure that they're on the latest and each revision gets incremented. So now you have a way to sort of say, okay, every cluster needs to be on this default template. And so here's a way to kind of do that. And here's a way to sort of enforce that and make sure that you're running the latest patched version of Kubernetes on all your clusters.
There was multiple questions that were, I think, a little bit hoping to see some demo that didn't include just the UI. So I think Chris said, hey, if I've got these cluster templates in YAML, can I sync Rancher with a Git repo somewhere so that it just automatically has more of a GitOps style of maintaining the cluster stuff? John said, how are the cluster templates stored? Can it integrate with version control system? There's another question earlier sort of about this. Can we maybe demo a little bit like how you would manage these in a more GitOps style of maintaining them externally and then just versioning them using Git?
So I'll take this question. So it really depends on how you want to manage them. If you're primarily managing Rancher through its UI, then that is where they live and they're stored and edited, and that is their source of truth. And then you can only create a new revision, right? You can't, if you have revision 000, you can't actually change that revision. You have to create 001. So they get stored in the system, and as you create new ones, they exist. You can delete revisions, though, right? So there's the potential to lose them that way. But I think most folks that are running infrastructure as code are also, and they want to kind of have this GitOps workflow. They're typically, sort of one of our assumptions is that they're typically using another tool to manage Rancher. And so it's actually the way that the Rancher kind of Terraform provider is designed, is that there's, there's consumers of Rancher that are, building, building clusters, consuming resources from Rancher, and then there's the people that are responsible for building and provisioning Rancher. And as part of that workflow, you'll be able to create the cluster template from the Terraform provider. So you'll be able to create Terraform modules and pass the cluster template in as a file into through your Terraform module to have it create it. So when you update it, you can have your Terraform plan and apply and make sure everything's kind of the way that you want it to go. And in that case, you would have the ability to version control and see the revision history and who edited it from your VCF.
Awesome. So then another question. There was a couple questions about shareable node templates. Helen said, we're quite interested in using shareable node templates. And then Brandon said, I know that you can share cluster templates, but what about node templates? How would you do that? Can you guys talk about that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so that with kind of cluster templates, we've seen that we sort of have some inconsistencies in the way that we're sharing templates, and so over the next set of releases, going into 2.4, that's something we're looking to address. Is what node templates, in particular shareable node templates, look like, and normalizing the sharing pattern. And I think the cluster templates line up pretty well with what we think will work out. And so we'll need to sort of be able to have similar sharing capabilities around node templates and around cloud credentials, or the other one that sort of, as an admin, if you don't really want people bringing their own credentials and you want everyone to use a node template that uses a specific set of credentials, how do we make that use case work? So that is something we are actively considering for our roadmap in the near term.
Okay, thanks, Bill. There was another question from CP who said, could storage be included as part of a template? And I know we talked about add-ons, but do you think maybe we could show just go into a little more detail on some of the things you could do with add-ons, and storage being one example that we might start with?
Yeah, it's a little hard to do on the fly. If your CSI, if your storage provider, if you're installing a storage plugin to all your nodes and it's deployed through a Kubernetes daemon set, then you could leverage the add-on capability within the cluster template. One of the things that we sort of see being, so you can leverage it. You could leverage the cluster template to install the add-on, as a Kubernetes daemon set or deployment, and that would meet it there or help you there. If it had to be installed, like a binary had to be added to the host before, something starts up, before kubelet starts up, that would be another situation where you would have to be coordinating the template with your node provisioning system. And so at that point, you'd be using a custom node, you'd be using custom for your cluster. And so with that, you would use your config management system or your node provisioning system to put the binaries in the right place, and then coordinate with the template that your kubelet could have an extra mount that would get to access to that binary on the host.
Okay. Kelvin asked, what is the new option auto replace mean in node template? Do you want to maybe chat about that? I think that's a 2.3 feature that's coming up.
Yeah, so in 2.3 we've improved our node pools so that they can auto heal and better respond to nodes dropping out of the cluster and coming back in. So with that, if you're using a Rancher provided node driver and you provision multiple instances of that, if you set that node pool to 3, and one of the nodes drops out, we will remove, evict, and then re-add a new node and replace that node is the way that functionality is supposed to work.
Great. And that'll be part of the 2.3 release coming up in
October.
That
is part of 2.3.
Is it already in the alpha versions for people that are playing around with current alpha releases?
It is. Yeah, everything so far is in there. That PR has gone in and is merged and has been in for a little bit, so it is in this alpha.
Okay. Last question I have. Marcy asked if in 2.3 Rancher has support for the new DigitalOcean managed Kubernetes as a cluster deploy option, like we have GKE and EKS and some of the other ones. Do you know if that's in 2.3? They're currently just using custom to import those.
I think that's still the case. I don't think we've added a DigitalOcean option yet.
Okay. You might want to look under. I thought we actually added it in the past. It was when I actually thought it was already there. So if not, maybe we'll double check. But get back to you, Marcy. If you ping me, I thought we actually had one and something you could import. So we'll take a look and see if we can help you out. If not, I'm sure we'd love to do it. Adding those kind of things isn't that difficult. All right. Well, I think that covers most of the demo and the overview of the new feature. Prachi, thank you so much for going into all this depth, and thanks everyone for so many great features. I'm going to just take over control again.
Thank you.
And for those of you who are new to Rancher, if you want to jump in, we have some great quick start guides on our website. So in terms of getting started, you just go to rancher.com and dive into the docs. You'll find quick starts on how to build out a Rancher environment, how to build one for HA, how to configure all the stuff we're talking about. 2.2 is currently the GA stable version. As Bill said, 2.3 will be coming in a few months. If you haven't joined if you are using Rancher and you haven't joined the Slack, please join it. It's where we can help you if you're running into issues. It's sort of us and the whole community working together to help everyone have success and chat about all these kind of issues and questions. It influences enormously the product direction, what we're doing. Obviously, it's an open source project. You can jump into GitHub. We love contributors. We love people who want to file issues. So if you want to help, if you want to add a DigitalOcean driver, if it's not there already, we would welcome the contribution. So if you're ever looking to contribute, there's some, Slack's a great way to get involved there. You can sort of ask in random how you'd like to get involved. There's also a developer side of it. So feel free to jump in that way. Just a quick update. This year's been really crazy for us with a lot of new projects, a lot of new things going on. I thought I'd just spend a minute updating everyone on the different projects, where they're at right now. So most of you know Rancher, Rancher OS. These projects are both GA. They've been around for a long time. RKE has been a part of GA Rancher now for more than a year. It's currently 0.3. It will be moving to 1.0 on its own later this year. I was just talking to our VP of Engineering about that. Longhorn, the Rancher open source storage service, is currently in beta. It is being discussed for contribution to the CNCF. So there's a proposal to provide that as a CNCF storage service, and hopefully that will kind of make its way through the sandboxing project in the next month or two. We just presented, I think, last week to the storage SIG, and They're going through a process there. So we're excited to see that moving along. Regardless, Longhorn is going to GA this year, so it's been being used by more and more people as an open source implementation of block storage for their Kubernetes clusters. And we're really excited about where that's at. The newest projects are all kind of on the right. All those previous projects have been bubbling for years now. K3s and K3OS are really our focus on lightweight distributed implementations of Kubernetes that can run on the edge or run on laptops. There are this project is really vibrant right now. There's all sorts of new things going on. There's an open source project called K3D, which is about running Docker in K3s. There's a new project that just last week called K3s Up or K3 Up. I can't remember what Alex named it, but it's really cool about kind of bringing up clusters in different ways. So this project is moving along really quickly. We expect to get it to beta this fall and target GA, towards the beginning of next year. The major things that the team is working on are all around HA capabilities at the cluster level and some really cool stuff for healing of clusters, things like that. So that's coming along. The main focus of K3s is just dead simple, easy operations of Kubernetes clusters at really small or medium scale. K3OS is also going through a lot of work right now. As K3OS is basically a Linux distribution based on K3s that tries to couple K3s, Kubernetes and Linux into a single executable that can be brought up on infrastructure on demand. That we're working actually with a number of large organizations that are kind of pilot users of this, trying to figure out how to put, Kubernetes, for example, into devices or into edge locations and such. So a lot of work there, a lot of work going into how to manage fleets of these things as well. Those are kind of the key requirements coming out of the community, how to manage lots of nodes that are each an independent Kubernetes cluster. Rio, we just announced before the summer, is a really cool project that we have been excited to see a lot of enthusiasm for. Rio is really focused on the other end. I mean, most of Rancher projects are kind of focused on the operations of Kubernetes, the storage around Kubernetes, the clusters themselves, the networking in Kubernetes. But Rio is actually focused on the user experience and driving adoption of Kubernetes, providing we call it a micro-PaaS, but really providing a serverless micro-PaaS experience that is leveraging, Kubernetes and Prometheus and Istio into, a really consumable interface on top of Kubernetes. It's very early, lots of work going on that, and we continue to work on it. Submariner is another really good candidate for probably being donated to a foundation. A lot of teams, not just at Rancher, but at other vendors working on this, because it solves a really key problem about how to create networks and network overlays that span multiple clusters, especially when those clusters are using different types of networking. So if the networks are, say an EKS cluster and an AKS cluster and a GKE cluster, and you do want to start heading towards federation and things like that, finding ways to normalize the network is pretty important. That's Submariner's role, is normalizing networks between different clusters, allowing for bridging between clusters. So Submariner, we've been really excited to see a lot of other kind of key players in the industry help in the development of that and add some resources, which is great because we're growing a ton. We're only about 150 people at Rancher, so getting help from the community and help from others is great as we're seeing just demand for all of these types of projects. So anyways, just wanted to provide a quick update on all these projects. You can find them all in our GitHub. If you just search for them, you'll find them quite easily. A lot of them have web pages like rio.io and k3s.io, so you can get information on a little bit of how to get started with these projects. But just keep in mind, most of them are early. Most of them are kind of developing. We expect them to, all come forward. I think everything's, a lot of times we create these new alpha projects. We don't really know how much demand there will be, but we've been really excited to see these things kind of moving forward. So as you need help or have questions on them, there's, you can go to Slack. There's sub channels for all of these things. You can ask for advice or where they're at, updates, things like that. I'm sure someone will be happy to provide it. With that, we can wrap up and take any final questions that came in. So I'll just take a look. Rob asks, could this be used to easily deploy a backup cluster, possibly even a geographically co-located one in the event of a total cluster failure, as long as we have an etcd snapshot? So Rob, I think you're talking about the cluster templates, and certainly that is, that's not the primary use case. And Bill, you mean if you're looking to actually back up and recover a cluster, the key is they're using the etcd backup and recovery capabilities in Rancher. Bill, do you want to maybe just chat a little bit about kind of what you're recommending to people in terms of if they want to do almost like an etcd snapshot or etcd recover with the config? I mean, do these work together? Is there a combination of cluster template and etcd snapshot that can be used to kind of recover more efficiently? Does the cluster template help a little bit with that? I think that's what Rob's asking.
Yeah, so they would be kind of complementary to each other. So in 2.2, we added etcd snapshot and backup into the Rancher UI component. So we make it really easy to take those snapshots. And so with the cluster template, you could apply it to both sides so that at least all of the Kubernetes configuration settings are the same, so that your Kubernetes versions, Kubernetes flags on all of the different components are all consistent and the same. And then if you needed to, you could spin up that cluster using you could spin up your vSide cluster and then do a restore from that snapshot to that cluster, and that would bring up this is an etcd snapshot, so sort of the limitation there is that it's really just kind of the Kubernetes data that it has, not the application data in volumes or anything like that.
There's another question, Bill, that Christian asked, whatever happened to GCP as a node provider? And as far as I know, we've never had GCP as a node provider because of some of the funkiness with how they do authentication of users. But do you want to maybe discuss that a little bit more? Maybe it was added at one point and I missed it.
No, that's exactly right. I don't think we've never had one due to the authentication mechanism that was used. You can work around it pretty well with if you're going to use GCP. I've seen it work really well with the Rancher 2 Terraform provider creating the cluster and getting the registration command, and then using the GCP or GCE modules to create the nodes and have them register in as kind of a custom cluster, and that works really well.
But there's no plans to. I mean, I don't think there's been any change. It's been, for a long time we've had a gap in supporting GCP as a node driver just because of the way they've done it. That I don't think there's any change on that, right?
Right. I mean, we're constantly looking at ways to improve the node drivers, and so through as maybe something that comes up in the next set of releases, we see demand for kind of the GCP node driver. We can reevaluate that for sure.
Alexi asked a last question, which was, I actually did an update on Rancher VM, and I apologize for that. I forgot to add Rancher VM to that list when I was making the slide. Rancher VM is still kind of in development. There's some renewed work going on it right now. There's a KubeVirt project we've been paying attention to, and trying to decide how much overlap there is, and if it makes sense to continue working on Rancher VM in that sense. But there's actually surprisingly, people are really still looking at how to do VMs on containers, and so there's a couple of projects right now that are around Rancher VM. So if you're using it, or you're thinking about using it, or you're looking for it, please let us know your use cases and stuff. It's one that we're interested in continuing to work on and develop. But right now it's definitely further down the priority list in terms of all the projects that are going on, just because of the adoption of some of the other ones has been just so overwhelming. It's really driving a ton of resources into things like Rio and K3S at the moment. So yeah, good question, Alexi. I'll be sure next time to provide a bit more update on Rancher VM. I'll get a better update from the engineering team on that one. Okay, with that, Prachi and Bill, thank you both so much for attending. If anyone has any other questions, you can find us on Slack or email or anything else, Twitter. Thanks a lot for being so engaged and so many great questions as always. We probably have our next meet up next month to get into upgrading to 2.3, possibly talking about some of the new information on K3S. So we'll hopefully see you then. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thanks a lot.